Imagine this. It's not failure you're afraid of. It's what failure says about you. That one bad grade, that one rejected proposal, that one relationship that fell apart. In the moment it happened, it didn't just feel like a loss. It felt like evidence. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, you were never good enough to begin with. And so, quietly, almost invisibly, you begin to pull back. You stop raising your hand. You take the safer path. You tell yourself you're being realistic, responsible, mature. But somewhere beneath that story, something else is running. A deep, ancient fear that if you try and fail again, you won't just lose the opportunity, you'll lose yourself. This video is about that fear. Not to shame it, not to cure it in 10 steps, but to understand it from the inside out, using what psychology, philosophy, and the science of how humans actually learn have been quietly telling us for decades. Because here's what's strange. The people most paralyzed by fear of failure are often the most capable. They're not afraid because they're weak. They're afraid because they care so deeply, so profoundly, that the thought of falling short feels unbearable. So let's begin, not with solutions, but with honesty. The illusion versus the reality. Here's a story that might feel familiar. There's a student, let's call her Maya, who scores perfectly on every multiple-choice test. She can define every term. She can repeat back every theory. Her teachers call her brilliant. Her parents call her gifted. And Maya, quietly, comes to believe that intelligence is something you have, like eye color. You're either born with it or you're not. Then one day, Maya faces a problem she has never seen before. No template to follow, no textbook answer waiting at the back. And something breaks open inside her. Not the problem, her. Because for the first time, she doesn't know. And not knowing feels catastrophic. This is the illusion that competence is about having the right answers. The reality is something far more complex and far more human. Benjamin Bloom, one of the most influential educational psychologists of the 20th century, spent his career studying how people learn, not just what they learn. He discovered something that seems obvious in hindsight, but was quietly revolutionary. There is an enormous difference between remembering information and truly understanding it, between recognizing a concept and being able to use it in a new context, between surface performance and genuine mastery. His taxonomy, his ladder of learning, moves from simple recall at the bottom all the way up through comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and finally evaluation. True understanding lives at the top of that ladder, but most of us spend our entire lives performing at the bottom, never realizing we're confusing familiarity for knowledge. And this matters for fear of failure in a way that most people never connect.
When your sense of intelligence is built on surface performance, on getting the right answer, looking smart, keeping up appearances, then any encounter with difficulty becomes threatening, because difficulty reveals the gap, and the gap, to a person who has tied their identity to looking competent, feels like exposure. So they avoid the gap. They avoid the challenge. They avoid the risk. Not because they're lazy, because they're protecting something. Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it. When was the last time you were genuinely confused and stayed confused long enough to actually learn something? Most of us can't answer that, because confusion is uncomfortable. It triggers something primal in us, a sense of threat, of incompetence, of not being enough. Our nervous system doesn't easily distinguish between intellectual uncertainty and social danger. Both activate the same ancient alarm system. Howard Gardner, the Harvard developmental psychologist who gave us the theory of multiple intelligences, was fundamentally asking a question that fear of failure makes us forget. What if intelligence isn't one thing? What if the narrow, test score version of smart that most of us were raised to pursue is only one small slice of human capacity? Because Gardner watched people, not just in classrooms, but in life. He watched musicians who couldn't pass algebra but could hear harmonic patterns no one else perceived. He watched dancers whose spatial and bodily intelligence surpassed any engineers. He watched naturalists, poets, architects, all of them operating from deep wells of intelligence that no standardized test ever measured. And what he found beneath all that variety was a truth that cuts straight to the heart of fear of failure. When people are working from their genuine form of intelligence, not the one they were told to value, but the one that actually lights them up, failure doesn't feel like death. It feels like information. But when people are trying to perform in systems that don't honor their particular kind of mind, every stumble confirms what they already secretly believe, that they are not enough. This is the psychological tension at the center of all fear of failure. It is not really about failure. It is about identity. When you fail at something you believe defines your worth, it's not just your performance that collapses, it's your story about who you are. The ego, that delicate inner narrator who's always writing and rewriting your self-concept, cannot tolerate that story falling apart. So it builds walls: procrastination, perfectionism, avoidance, burnout disguised as busyness. All of it is the ego doing what it believes is protective work, keeping you away from situations where failure could shatter the narrative. And here is the painful irony. In trying to protect you from failure, it guarantees a different, quieter kind of failure. The failure of the unlived life. The failure of potential that was never tested because the test felt too dangerous. Let me teach you something. And I want to teach it the way Richard Feynman taught physics. Not with jargon, not with complexity, but with radical simplicity. Think of your mind like a garden.
Most of us, when we learn something new, we plant a seed and immediately want to see a flower. We want to understand instantly. We want mastery to arrive quickly, cleanly, without mess. And when the soil is hard, when the seed doesn't sprout overnight, we assume something is wrong with us, not the soil. Us. But real learning, the kind Bloom was pointing at when he described the upper levels of his taxonomy, looks nothing like that. Real learning looks messy. It looks like confusion. It looks like a concept you half understand, then lose, then find again, but from a slightly different angle. It looks like making a mistake and being curious about it instead of ashamed. Bloom called the deepest level of learning synthesis and evaluation. Feynman called it being able to explain something to a child. Gardner called it applying intelligence in context. But they were all pointing at the same thing. Real mastery is not about holding information. It's about transforming it, making it yours, weaving it into how you see. Now here is where fear of failure enters. The person afraid of failure doesn't just want to learn, they want to appear to have already learned. They skip the confusion. They pretend to understand. They nod along in conversations they're not following. They submit work that looks good from a distance but collapses under scrutiny. And then, in a quiet moment alone, they feel like a fraud. Psychologists call this imposter syndrome, but I want to offer you a reframe. Imposter syndrome is not a sign that you are a fraud. It is a sign that you are aware of the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And awareness of that gap is not a problem. It is the beginning of genuine learning. The person who feels no gap is the one who isn't growing. So the next time that uncomfortable feeling arrives, the sensation of not knowing, of being out of your depth, I want you to consider a different question than the one fear whispers. Fear asks, does this mean I'm not good enough? But wisdom asks, what is this gap trying to teach me? That single shift from threat to inquiry is the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset.
not as a motivational slogan, as a lived, embodied, daily practice. Somewhere along the way, most of us absorbed a very particular story about intelligence. The story goes like this. Some people are naturally smart and some aren't. Smart people get things quickly. Smart people don't struggle. Smart people don't need to ask for help. And if you are smart, then struggling is embarrassing because it suggests you might not be. This story is not just wrong, it is psychologically destructive. Because when you believe intelligence is fixed, effort becomes threatening. Effort implies you aren't naturally good at something. And admitting you aren't naturally good at something implies you aren't intelligent. So you protect your identity by doing only what comes easily. And over time, your world gets smaller and smaller, not because you ran out of talent, but because you ran out of safe spaces to try.
Gardner's insight was that intelligence is not a number, it is a profile, a constellation, a set of capacities that looks different in every person and can be developed, not just discovered. Your linguistic intelligence can deepen, your interpersonal intelligence can grow, your spatial reasoning can be cultivated through practice, feedback, failure, and reflection. And Bloom would add, how you engage with material determines how deeply you understand it. A student who passively receives information learns far less than a student who argues with it, questions it, applies it, and teaches it back. This means mastery is not a destination, it is a way of moving. It is a posture of curiosity, a willingness to be wrong, a habit of asking, what am I missing? What have I assumed without examining? What would change if I were wrong about this? That is intellectual humility, and it is the single most underrated form of intelligence there is. Because the person who says, I might be wrong, is not weaker than the person who is certain. They are infinitely more capable of learning. And in a world that changes as fast as ours, the ability to learn, to genuinely, humbly, curiously learn, is more valuable than any fixed body of knowledge. Fear of failure is, at its root, a failure of identity flexibility. It is being so attached to a particular story about who you are that you cannot risk finding out the story might need revising. The antidote is not confidence in your current self. It is curiosity about your future self.
I want to tell you about a moment that changes people. Not a dramatic moment, not a breakthrough, just a quiet, private shift in how something feels. It happens when a person who has always been afraid to fail faces something hard, a problem, a challenge, a situation they cannot immediately solve, and instead of contracting, instead of retreating into shame or avoidance, they get interested. Just that, interested. I don't know how to do this yet. I wonder what's going on here. I wonder what I'd need to understand differently to see this clearly. That word, yet, is not trivial. Carol Dweck, building on the foundations that Bloom and Gardner laid, showed that the word yet acts as a bridge between the current self and the future self. It holds open the space that fear tries to collapse, and in that open space, something new can grow. When you begin to hold problems this way, as information rather than indictment, something remarkable happens to your relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty stops being a threat and becomes a teacher. You begin to trust yourself not because you have all the answers, but because you've proven to yourself, in small and accumulating ways, that you can work through not knowing. This is what Bloom meant by the highest levels of learning, not the storage of facts, but the transformation of how you see. When you genuinely understand something deeply, it doesn't just sit in your mind as a piece of knowledge. It changes your perception. It changes what you notice. It changes how you interpret new experiences. And fear of failure becomes, slowly, not a wall, but a signal that something meaningful is at stake, a signal that growth is nearby, a signal that the edge of your current understanding, that uncomfortable, trembling edge, is exactly where the most important learning lives. This is not a metaphor. This is neuroscience. The brain consolidates learning most powerfully through challenge and error. The mild stress of not yet knowing actually enhances long-term retention. Confusion, worked through, is more valuable than clarity handed to you. Your discomfort is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be respected. So, here we are. You came into this video perhaps recognizing yourself in some of this. Perhaps you've been playing small. Perhaps you've been avoiding something important. Perhaps you've been confusing the appearance of competence with actual growth, performing well enough that no one questions you, while privately sensing the distance between who you seem to be and who you are becoming. And maybe that recognition feels uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort is not your enemy. Benjamin Bloom spent his career trying to understand what it means to truly know something, not to recite it, not to perform it, but to hold it so deeply that it changes who you are. And Howard Gardner spent his career trying to remind us that the human mind is far richer, far more varied, far more capable than any single measure could ever capture. Together, they were saying something simple and profound. You are more than your results. You are more than your scores, your resume, your track record, your last mistake. You are a mind in process, a self in motion, a learner who is never truly finished. Fear of failure forgets this. It freezes you in a single moment, holds a single mistake up like a mirror and says, "This is who you are." But you are not a moment. You are a movement. And the most important thing you can do, not tomorrow, not after you've healed everything, not when you feel ready, but now, in this very ordinary moment, is to let yourself not know. Let yourself be uncertain. Let yourself be in the middle of something you haven't figured out yet. Because the person who can stay curious in the presence of failure, who can hold confusion with gentleness instead of shame, who can say, "I don't understand this yet," without it meaning anything about their worth, that person is not just a better learner, they are freer. So, I'll leave you with this question, not to answer quickly, but to carry with you. What would you attempt if failure didn't define you, only taught you? Sit with that, slowly. Because somewhere in the silence after that question, something might shift. And that shift, quiet, private, unhurried, that is where growth actually begins.